You know that feeling, right? That moment of panic before a big handshake? Or just dreading raising your arm on a hot day? We've all been there. Sweating is totally normal. It's actually essential. But what happens when it goes into overdrive? Well, today, we're going to break down the science of excessive sweating and body odor. We'll look at everything from simple fixes to some pretty advanced medical treatments. So let's get right into it and really understand the biology behind sweat and the solutions that are out there.
All right, here's the game plan. First up, we're going to cover the basics, why we sweat at all. Then, we'll get into what it means when it becomes too much or too strong. After that, we'll look at the practical first-line fixes you can try. And finally, we'll climb the ladder of more advanced medical options for when those first steps just aren't enough.
So let's start with section 1, why we sweat. You know, it's the body's essential cooling system. Before we can even begin to talk about too much sweat, we got to understand its real purpose. Because it's not just some annoying thing that happens. It's actually a pretty brilliant piece of our biology.
So why is sweating so important? Well, at its most basic level, it's our body's #1 cooling system. Think of it like this. You've got a little thermostat in your brain called the hypothalamus. It's constantly checking your core temperature. And when you start to overheat, maybe you're working out, or it's a super hot day, or you've got a fever, that thermostat kicks on and tells your body to produce sweat. And as that sweat evaporates off your skin, boom, you cool down. It's what keeps us safe from really dangerous stuff like heat exhaustion or heat stroke.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, because it turns out not all sweat is the same. You actually have two totally different types of sweat glands doing different jobs. On one hand, you have the eccrine glands. These guys are everywhere, palms, face, all over, and they make that watery, odorless sweat that's all about cooling you down. They've been working hard since you were about 2 or 3. But then you've got the apocrine glands. These are mostly in your underarms and a few other areas, and they don't even wake up until puberty. They produce a thicker, kind of milky fluid that's also odorless at first. But this is the stuff that ends up being linked to body odor.
All right, section 2, too much, too strong. Now we're going to define the conditions. So, we've talked about the normal process. But what happens when that system just goes haywire? When you're producing way too much sweat, or that sweat starts to have a really strong odor.
The official medical term for this is hyperhidrosis. And here's the key thing to get. This isn't just about sweating when you're working out or feeling nervous. Hyperhidrosis is when your body is pumping out sweat way, way beyond what it needs for cooling. And you can imagine this can have a massive impact on someone's life. Think about social situations, work, just day-to-day confidence.
So how does a doctor actually figure out if someone has primary hyperhidrosis? Well, they have a pretty specific checklist. First, it's got to be going on for at least 6 months, and they have to rule out any other medical reasons for it. That's a must. Then you need at least 2 more things from this list. Like it's bad enough that it gets in the way of your daily life, maybe it runs in your family, or it started before you were 25. And here's a really interesting one. The sweating almost always stops when you're asleep. Kind of fascinating, right?
And to get a handle on just how severe it is, doctors use something called the Hyperhidrosis Disease Severity Scale. It sounds complicated, but it's really just a simple 1 to 4 scale. A 1 means you barely notice it and it doesn't mess with your day. A 2 is, tolerable but sometimes annoying. But once you get to 3 or 4, we're talking about sweating that's barely tolerable or even completely intolerable. And it's always getting in the way. What's so great about this is that it really shows that this condition isn't just about how much you sweat, it's about how much it affects your actual life.
Now, what about the smell? That's a whole other thing, but it's related. It's called bromhidrosis. And here is the most important thing to remember. Sweat itself, even that thicker apocrine sweat, doesn't actually smell when it comes out. The odor we're all familiar with, that's created when the bacteria living on our skin start to break down the fats and proteins in that apocrine sweat. So it's not the sweat, it's the bacteria having a feast.
Okay, section 3, first line fixes. These are the practical steps and daily habits. We've defined the problem, we get the science. So now let's talk solutions. We're going to start with the stuff that's easiest to access, the things that are really the foundation of managing all this. But before we even get into how they work, we have to tackle a huge myth right off the bat.
I'm sure you've heard the concerns about aluminum in antiperspirants. Well, the research is crystal clear on this. I'm going to read this quote directly because it's that important. There is no evidence of any connection between use of aluminum-containing antiperspirants and breast cancer. That is a really powerful statement, and it's crucial for separating medical fact from all the fiction you see online.
So how do antiperspirants actually do their job? It's a really clever bit of chemistry, actually. The active ingredient, usually some kind of aluminum salt, mixes with your sweat and forms a tiny temporary plug right at the top of your sweat duct. That little plug then sends a message back down to the sweat gland basically saying, hey, we're full up here, slow it down. So it's not just masking anything, it's actively telling your body to produce less sweat.
Now, if you really want to get the most out of your antiperspirant, especially the stronger stuff, it turns out technique is everything. Here's the #1 pro tip. Apply it at bedtime. Why? Because your sweat glands are way less active at night, which gives that plug a much better chance to form properly. The other huge rule is it has to go on completely dry skin. This helps it work better and, really importantly, prevents irritation. A couple of simple changes like that can honestly make a world of difference.
And it's not just about antiperspirants, right? Your daily habits can play a huge role too. Think about your clothes. Wearing breathable stuff like cotton instead of synthetics lets the sweat actually evaporate instead of just getting trapped. And simple things, like alternating your shoes every day so they can totally dry out, or using foot powders. And since we know odor is all about bacteria, a good, regular bathing routine is key to just reducing the number of bacteria on your skin in the first place.
All right, on to Section 4, Advanced Medical Options. We can think of this as a ladder of interventions. So what happens when all those first-line fixes just aren't cutting it? For people with more moderate to severe hyperhidrosis, this is where you start climbing the ladder to find more powerful medical options. So, what's on this next rung of the ladder? Well, there are a few really effective therapies. You've got things like prescription medicated pads, specifically for your face or underarms. Of course, there's botulinum toxin, Botox, which can be injected to block the nerve signals that turn on sweat glands, and that can work for 6 to 9 months. There are also oral medications you can take, but the catch is they affect your whole body, which can lead to some pretty significant side effects, like a super dry mouth. And for hands and feet, there's a cool procedure called iontophoresis, which uses a very mild electrical current in water to help block the sweat ducts.
And that brings us to the very top of the ladder. The final and most drastic step, surgery. It's a procedure called endoscopic thoracic sympathectomy, or ETS. And it works. It can permanently stop sweating in places like your palms by literally cutting the nerves responsible. But, and this is a huge but, look at the trade-off. There's a really high risk of what's called compensatory sweating. That means your body just starts sweating like crazy in other areas, like your back or your chest. And the research says this new sweating can be even worse than the original problem. So, it's a decision with some really serious, potentially life-altering consequences.
So after all of that, after looking at all the science, the treatments, the solutions, we're left with this one last, really interesting question. Sweating is natural, right? It's a healthy, necessary thing our bodies do. So where is the line? Where do we draw the line between treating a legitimate medical condition that can truly wreck someone's quality of life and just trying to meet a social pressure to be perfectly dry and odorless all the time? It's a tricky one, and it's definitely something to think about.